on a recent Tuesday morning, as a thin March rain moved sideways across the high ground of Bodmin Moor. Prince William stepped out of a plain, dark car at the edge of a working slate quarry and did something that no court circular in the long history of the Duchy of Cornwall had ever previously been required to record. He did not convene a meeting in a paneled room. He did not preside over a session in a building whose walls carried the weight of centuries. He walked, in a waxed coat already darkening at the shoulders, across 40 yards of wet aggregate toward a disused stone engine shed, inside which stood a machine the size of a small barn, draped in tarpaulin, waiting to either prove itself or fail in front of him. The single sheet of paper that had been circulated the previous week to the small group of people now gathered inside that shed contained, near the top, two phrases that had never before appeared together on any official Duchy document. The first was fiscal prudence. The second was live failure demonstration. To anyone who had spent a career in the financial governance of the estate, the pairing read very nearly as a contradiction in terms. To the young engineer standing beside the tarpaulin with rainwater running off the back of his neck, the pairing read as the whole point. Prince William, in his capacity as the Duke of Cornwall, had decided that the two would be tested against each other in the same hour, in the same room, with himself standing in it. And in doing so, he had signaled that the estate was entering a kind of mourning it had never before agreed to have. There was no head of a long table here. There was a workbench scarred by 40 years of use, a concrete floor with a drain running down its center, and a roofline through which the moor wind found three separate ways in. The shed did not provide a standard the way a castle does. It provided a fact. Whatever happened here would happen on slate and steel and cold air, with no paneling to soften it and no precedent to lean on. And everyone who ducked under the low doorway understood that distinction the moment they stepped inside. William had asked for it this way. He could have had the demonstration brought to him, cleaned and rehearsed on an estate lawn under a marquee. He had instead asked to come to the place where the thing was actually made, in the weather it was actually built to withstand, on the morning it was scheduled to be put under deliberate strain. The choice was conspicuous. It was, those present would later reflect, entirely deliberate. He arrived not as a man being shown a success, but as a man who had asked to be present for the possibility of failure, and that was a different kind of arrival altogether. By the time the tarpaulin came off the rig, and the first slow hum of its hydraulics filled the shed, the quiet inside had taken on the particular quality of a room that knows it is about to watch something it cannot take back. To understand why a future king was standing on a quarry floor in the rain, watching a machine he did not control, it is necessary to understand what the Duchy of Cornwall is, and what it is increasingly being asked to risk. The duchy was established by royal charter in 1337 under Edward III, created to provide an independent income for the heir to the throne, so that the Prince of Wales would never be wholly dependent on the crown or on Parliament for his means of living. Its founding purpose was financial and dynastic. Nearly 7 centuries later, that purpose remains technically intact. What has changed, and changed in a way that cannot be reversed, is the question of what the duchy's money is permitted to be used for, and how much of it may responsibly be placed at risk in pursuit of something that has not yet been proven to work. The estate today holds roughly 135,000 acres across more than 20 counties, with its heaviest concentration in Cornwall and Devon. It owns farms in foreshore, villages and woodland, commercial streets and stretches of moor that have been quarried for slate and granite since long before the duchy existed to own them. This particular quarry, on the cold northern edge of Bodmin Moor, had supplied roofing slate to half the parish churches within a day's cart ride for the better part of 300 years. Its working face had gone quiet a generation ago. Its engine shed had stood empty for nearly as long. The estate had kept it, maintained its roof against the worst of the weather, and waited in the patient institutional way that landed estates wait for a reason to use it again. reason when it came did not arrive as nostalgia. It arrived as arithmetic. The housing situation in the villages strung along the moor's edge was not a statistic to the families living. It was a daily, narrowing fact. Cottages that had once housed quarrymen and farm laborers had become second homes and holiday lets, occupied for a handful of weeks a year and dark the rest of it. The young people raised in these parishes, the ones who wanted to stay, who had family here, who already worked here, could no longer afford a roof within reach of the work. The waiting list held by the local housing association was not long in the way a city list is long. It was long in the way that mattered more. Nearly every name on it was a name someone in the next village could put a face to. The duchy owned the land. The duchy held the resources. The duchy could, in principle, build. But building costs money, and the duchy's money is not the duke's to spend as he pleases. It is held in trust, governed by people whose entire professional obligation is to ensure that the estate is passed to the next heir in no worse condition than it was received. To those people, the proposal that the estate should pour a meaningful sum into an unproven printing technology, a machine that extruded structural building components from a polymer and mineral composite that had never been deployed at scale on duchy land, and that was now to be subjected to a public test designed to push it until something broke, was not obviously prudent. It was, by the most defensible reading of their duty, the opposite. That tension between the obligation to act and the obligation to protect was the reason for the mourning. It was why a sheet of paper carried two phrases that should not have shared a page. And it was why William had chosen to stand in the cold and watch rather than be told about it afterward. The people who came in under the low doorway that morning arrived separately, within a quarter of an hour of one another, and each of them brought into the shed a different answer to the question the morning existed to settle. Sarah Trelawney came first, as she had come first to every stage of this project for 2 years. She was the duchy's director for the pilot, the person whose name was attached to the proposal in the place where blame attaches if a thing goes wrong in public. She arrived with a folder she did not open, a flask of tea she did not drink, and the particular steadiness of someone who has decided that the only way through a frightening morning is to be visibly unfrightened in front of the people watching her. She had spent 2 years arguing internally for permission to do exactly what was about to be done, and she had won that permission by accepting, in writing, that her reputation would be the first thing the failure landed on if there were one. She set the folder on the workbench, looked once at the covered rig, and then stood where she could see both the machine and the door, because she wanted to see every face as it came in. Henry Vane came second, and the temperature of the shed seemed to drop a degree when he did. Vane was a trustee of the duchy's investment governance, one of the people whose entire function was to say no on the estate's behalf when no was the responsible word. He was not a hostile man. He was something more difficult than hostile. He was correct often, and he knew it, and he had built a long career on the unglamorous discipline of being the person in the room who asks what happens to the money if this does not work. He arrived carrying a single slim document and an expression of professional regret, the look of a man who has come not to argue in bad faith, but to do, carefully and thoroughly, a job he believes is necessary. He greeted Sarah Trelawney with genuine courtesy and no warmth at all, because the two were not enemies. They were simply the two halves of a decision that had not yet been made. Daniel Penrose came third, and almost no one heard him come in. He was the systems engineer who had built the rig, not bought it, not commissioned it, built it, across 8 years, from a doctoral idea into a working machine standing under tarpaulin in a quarry shed. He was the youngest person in the room by a decade, and the least senior by every measure the estate used to rank people, and he carried none of it as though it weighed anything. He came in shaking rain off a flat cap, nodded to Sarah, nodded to Vane, and went straight to the machine, where he crouched and put one hand flat against the cold steel of its frame in a gesture that looked, to at least one person watching, exactly like a man checking on something living. He did not make a case for his work as he entered. He went and stood beside it, which was, in its way, a case of its own. Edwin Karn came last, and he had not, strictly speaking, been required to come at all. Karn was a stonemason. He was past 70, had cut and laid slate and granite on duchy buildings for more than 50 years, and had been invited to the demonstration as an observer, a courtesy, a gesture toward the trades whose knowledge the new method claimed to respect. He had no vote. He carried no folder. He came in slowly, took off his cap, looked around the shed with the unhurried attention of a man who had worked in 100 sheds like it, and then walked to the workbench, where a sample panel produced by an earlier run sat waiting. He did not pick it up. He pressed his thumb against its surface slowly, the way a man tests whether bread is fresh, and then he took his thumb away and said nothing. It was a small thing. No one remarked on it. But it was the first time he did it, and it would not be the last. William greeted each of them himself by name, with a handshake that did not hurry. His manner was warm and entirely without performance. He did not fill the shed with talk. When the four of them were inside and the door was pulled to against the wind, he asked a single question, and he did not direct it at any one of them. He asked it of the room. He asked them what a failure was for. The question was not rhetorical, and it did not float for long before Henry Vane answered it, because answering questions of exactly that kind, plainly and without flinching, was the discipline of his professional life. A failure, Vane said, was a thing you organized your affairs to avoid. That was the entire purpose of governance. The estate did not exist to be brave. It existed to be passed on intact. He laid the case out without raising his voice and without unfairness, which made it heavier rather than lighter. The pilot, as designed, would commit a material sum to a technology with no track record on duchy land. The demonstration scheduled for that morning was not a careful first step. It was, by the engineer's own design documents, a deliberate stress test, a run intended to push the printed components until they failed, with cameras present and a member of the royal family standing on the floor. Vane did not dispute that the technology was clever. He disputed the wisdom of letting its first significant public moment be one engineered to produce a visible break. An institution, he said, does not get to choose which 30 seconds of its morning the world remembers. It only gets to choose whether to create those 30 seconds in the first place. His recommendation, which he had put in writing and which he now stated aloud so that it could not later be said he had hidden, was that the live demonstration be canceled and the pilot return to a quieter, slower, lower-risk path. Sarah Trelawney answered from the opposite ground, and she did not answer it angrily, because she had known for 2 years that this was the argument she would one day have to win in front of someone who could end the project with a sentence. A failure, she said, was information you had refused to pay for in advance. Every quiet, cautious, behind-closed-doors development path the estate had ever taken with a new method had produced the same result. Years of expense, a polished claim, and a first public deployment in which the institution discovered, in front of the very people it was trying to serve, the things it had declined to find out in private. The waiting list did not have those years. The families on it could not afford the institution's comfort. The whole point of the morning, she said, was to find out now, on a quarry floor, with no one yet living inside anything, exactly what this method did when it was pushed too far, because the alternative was to find that out later, when someone's home was the thing being pushed. Daniel Penrose said almost nothing during this. He stood by the rig with one hand still resting on its frame, and when William glanced at him, he offered only that the machine was ready and that he stood by the test as written. He did not defend it at length. He did not match Vane's argument with a counter-argument. His restraint was conspicuous, and it was, those present would later understand, the most important thing he did in that part of the morning, because it left the room with no one to argue against except the question itself. William, too, said very little. He asked Vane to clarify a figure. He asked Trelawney to restate, in plain words, what specifically the test was designed to break and why. He reflected back what he heard in language that showed he had understood not only the surface of each position, but the duty underneath it. That Vane was not timid and Trelor was not reckless. That both were doing faithfully the job the estate had asked them to do, and that the estate had, by its own design, asked them to do jobs that pointed in opposite directions. He did not say which way he leaned. He created, with his silence, the conditions under which the answer would have to come from the room rather than from him. The tension reached its tightest point without a single raised voice. Henry Vane reached into his document, took out one page, and laid it face up on the workbench, next to the sample panel Edwin Karn had pressed his thumb to. It was a single sheet of figures, the projected cost of the pilot set against the projected cost of the reputational damage if the demonstration failed publicly. He did not explain it. He did not need to. He simply turned it so that William could read it, and stepped back, and let the page make the argument he had decided he should not make again with his mouth. Daniel Penrose looked at the page for a moment. Then he looked at William. Then, without asking anyone's permission, he turned, walked to the rig, and reached for the control panel. What happened over the next 4 minutes was watched by everyone in the shed in near total silence, and it did not go the way Sarah Trelor had spent 2 years hoping it would go. The machine woke with a low, even hum, and the print head, a heavy gantry-mounted nozzle moving on rails Penrose had cut and aligned himself, began to lay the composite in slow, deliberate passes, building upward the test specimen the demonstration was organized around. A single load-bearing wall panel, the kind that would, in a real house, carry a roof. The material came out warm and gray and faintly steaming in the cold air. For 2.5 minutes it built cleanly, course on course, and Trelor allowed herself the smallest interior loosening, the beginning of the feeling that this might, after everything, simply work in front of the one man who most needed to see it work. Then, at a point perhaps 2/3 of the way up the panel, there was a sound. It was not a small sound. It was a sharp structural crack, loud enough in the stone shed to make Henry Vane's head turn before he had decided to turn it, and along the face of the rising panel, a fracture opened, visible, dark, running diagonally through the still-warm composite like a flaw through slate. The print head did not stop. It continued its slow passes, building course onto a panel that had just, audibly and in front of cameras and a future king, broken. For a moment no one moved. The sound seemed to hang in the cold air longer than sound should, and in that moment the morning appeared to almost everyone in the shed to have delivered its verdict. Henry Vane did not look triumphant. He was not that kind of man, but he looked, unmistakably, like a man whose written recommendation had just been confirmed by the only argument that ends arguments, which is the thing itself going wrong. Sarah Trelor's face did not break, but the small interior loosening of 30 seconds earlier closed again, hard. The story the morning had been telling, the careful champion of need, vindicated by a clean success in front of power, appeared, in the space of one fracture, to have inverted into its opposite. It was Daniel Penrose who broke the silence, and he did not break it the way a man defends a disaster. He let the print head finish its current pass, reached out without hurry and stopped the machine. Then he turned around and explained, in a voice with no defensiveness in it at all, what everyone had just watched. The crack, he said, was supposed to happen. He had not printed that panel at the correct cure setting. He had printed it at a deliberately, precisely wrong one, a setting he had calculated to induce failure at a known point, under a known load, in a known direction. The demonstration was never a test of whether the material could succeed. A test of success, he said, tells you almost nothing, because a thing that has not been allowed to fail has not been understood. It has only been flattered. What the morning was designed to show was not that the panel held. It was how the panel broke, where the fracture began, how far it ran, whether it ran fast and shattered, the way brittle things fail, taking everything around them down, or whether it ran slow and stopped, holding its load even while cracked, the way a material fails when it has been engineered to fail safely. He walked to the fractured panel as he spoke and put his hand flat on it, and the panel, cracked clean through, did not move under his weight. It had broken exactly where he said it would, run exactly as far as he said it would, and then stopped and held. The disaster had not been the failure of the demonstration. The disaster had been the demonstration. The thing Henry Vane had read as catastrophe and Sarah Trelor had read as ruin was the single most informative 4 minutes the pilot had ever produced, and it had produced it on a quarry floor in front of the people who needed to decide, with no one living inside anything, which was precisely, exactly, the entire point. Edwin Carn, who had said nothing all morning, walked over to the broken panel. He did not ask whether he might. He put his thumb against the fracture itself, against the dark diagonal line running through the composite, and pressed, slowly, the way he had pressed the sample on the bench, the way he had pressed 10,000 surfaces across 50 years of deciding whether a thing had been made honestly or only made to look made. He held his thumb there for a long moment. Then he took it away, looked at Penrose, and gave a single short nod, the smallest possible gesture, and the only verdict in the room that no one in it would have dreamed of disputing. Henry Vane was quiet for a considerable time. When he spoke, he did not withdraw his recommendation, and he did not concede the larger question of cost, because that was not his way and those things remained genuinely unresolved. He did something more significant than concession. He asked a question, a precise, technical governance question about whether the failure data could be independently verified and recorded in a form a trustee could rely on. And in asking it, he moved visibly from opposition to inquiry. The distinction was not lost on anyone present. Opposition argues with a thing. Inquiry has begun to take it seriously. The room registered the shift in the silence that followed, and William let that silence stand without putting anything into it, because it was doing on its own the work he had spent the whole morning declining to do for it. It was at this point that William chose to speak at length, and what he said had the quality of words assembled slowly over a long time, rather than arranged the night before. He began not with the machine, but with the page Henry Vane had laid on the bench. He said that Vane had been right to put it there, and right to make the argument it made, and that an estate that did not have a Henry Vane in the room was an estate that would eventually spend its way through the inheritance of people not yet born. He was not, he said, going to pretend the question of cost had been answered by a panel breaking on schedule. It had not been. It remained open, and it was supposed to remain open because the morning had not been called to close it. The morning had been called, he said, to find out something more basic than whether the estate could afford this. It had been called to find out whether the estate could be trusted to test things in the open. He spoke then about the families on the list, and he did not speak about them as a category. He spoke about them as people in specific villages within a few miles of where everyone was standing, whose lives were being narrowed, quietly and without anyone choosing it, by the gap between what a roof here cost and what work here paid. He said that those families were owed many things by an institution that had held this land for 700 years, but that the first thing they were owed was honesty about the things being built for them, and that an institution that only ever demonstrated its successes, that only ever let the world see the polished version, had not been honest with them. It had been honest with itself. The false choice, he said, had been the one the morning had seemed to offer at the start. Prudence on one side, courage on the other, as though to be careful was to be timid and to act was to be reckless. That framing had paralyzed better institutions than this one. The real question was not whether to be prudent or brave. It was whether prudence could be made to mean something braver than secrecy. Whether a body responsible for protecting an inheritance could discharge that responsibility by testing things publicly and failing publicly and being seen to learn publicly, rather than by the older, safer, and ultimately less trustworthy method of being seen only when it had already won. He turned briefly to Daniel rose and said the thing about the morning that mattered most. The panel breaking, he said, had told them more than the panel holding ever could have. A success would have asked them to take its word. The failure had shown them it's working. And an institution that wanted the people on that list to one day live inside this method had an obligation, not a preference, an obligation to be the kind of institution that found out how it broke before anyone's home was the thing it broke. He ended on what honesty costs and what it is worth. It would have been easier, he said, and entirely defensible, to have had this demonstration brought to him cleaned and rehearsed on a lawn. Easier still to have canceled it, as Vane had reasonably advised, and developed the thing quietly until it could be unveiled already perfect. The estate had the resources to buy itself that comfort. What it could not buy, and what no amount of resource could manufacture, was the particular trust that is only ever extended to a body that lets itself be watched while it is still uncertain. That trust was the thing the morning had been spent on. It was, he said, worth more than the panel, worth more than the figure on Vane's page, and worth precisely the discomfort it had cost everyone in the shed to stand there and watch something break on purpose. The room received this in a silence that was not empty but full. The silence of people who have understood that the thing they thought they had come to watch fail had, in failing, done the one thing it was actually there to do. The implications of what happened on that quarry floor extend well beyond the single fractured panel now sitting, labeled and photographed, on a duchy workbench, and well beyond the cold edge of Bodmin Moor. The Duchy of Cornwall is not the only institution in Britain holding land, money, and an obligation it cannot easily reconcile. Charitable trusts, university endowments, church commissioners, municipal estates, and private foundations across the country sit on the same intersection. A genuine need in front of them, an unproven means of meeting it, and a governance duty that, read conservatively, always counsels the quiet path. The instinct of nearly all of them, when faced with an untested method, is the instinct Henry Vane gave honest voice to in the shed: develop it privately, reveal it finished, and let the public see only the version that has already succeeded. What the morning on the moor demonstrated was not a printing technology. It was a different posture an institution can take toward its own uncertainty. The decision to be watched while it is still finding out, to let the failure happen where it can be seen and learned from rather than where it can only be hidden or denied. That posture is, in principle, transferable to almost any of those bodies in almost any field. The technical specifics of a polymer composite cracking on schedule matter only on this moor. The method underneath them, design the test to fail, run it in public, record exactly how it breaks, and let the people you are accountable to watch you do it, is not specific to housing, or to slate, or to a duchy. It is a way of holding power that is unusual precisely because it is uncomfortable, and uncommon precisely because comfort is available to anyone with enough resource to purchase it. The international dimension is no smaller. The pressure to build affordable, durable housing without the years and the budgets that conventional certainty demands is not a Cornish problem. It is a condition shared across rural communities in Europe, across the developing world, across every society in which the cost of finding out slowly has become a cost the people waiting can no longer afford to pay. The approach being recorded in careful governance language by Henry Vane's now satisfied request for verified failure data is in principle available to any of them, not the machine, but the willingness to break the first one on purpose in the open before anyone has to live inside it. Edwin Carn was the last to leave the shed. He put his cap back on, walked once more to the workbench, and stood over the broken panel for a moment in the gray light coming through the imperfect roof. He did not say anything. He had not said anything all morning, save a single nod. He pressed his thumb a final time against the dark line of the fracture. The way he had pressed every surface that mattered to him across 50 years of deciding what was made honestly and what was only made to pass. He held it there, Then he took his thumb away, looked at the rain still moving sideways across the quarry beyond the open door, and went out into it without a word, leaving the panel where it lay, cracked clean through, holding its weight and telling, to anyone willing to come and stand in the cold and look at it honestly, exactly the truth it had been built to tell.